Hello, welcome to PC Jack. On Thursday 5th of August, AMD launched the Ryzen 5 5600G and the Ryzen 7 5700G. Do gamers now finally have a chance to game while the ongoing GPU shortage continues? Yes, but with some compromises. So, with the release of AMD's Ryzen 5000 series of APUs, gamers believe this may be the solution we've all been waiting for. While trying to buy a graphics card at MSRP is an absolutely monumental task currently, a lot of gamers have been turning to integrated graphics to tide them over while the GPU shortage continues. But, as of filming, and even over the last few months, the Ryzen APUs such as the 3400G and the 3200G, in addition to the previous generation 2000 series APUs, have either been out of stock or have been priced well above MSRP. While you could go for an Intel CPU which comes with integrated graphics across most of their SKUs, the performance of Intel graphics compared to Vega is still slightly lower, so you would be sacrificing performance there, depending on which CPU you choose. But AMD's new offerings might be the solution we've all been waiting for. So today, I'll be taking a look at the Ryzen 5 5600G and seeing what sort of performance you could expect out of this APU. Firstly, let's run over the specs and the features before we get into some gaming. The Ryzen 5 5600G is a Zen 3 6-core 12-thread processor with a base clock of 3.9 GHz and a boost clock of 4.4 GHz, and also includes 16 MB of L3 cache, down from 32 MB compared to the 5600X. Powering the iGPU, the 5600G features Radeon Vega graphics with 7 compute units and a clock speed of 1900 MHz. Also included is an AMD Wraith Stealth stock cooler, which is more than enough to keep the 5600G's thermals in check. However, if you are looking to boost this CPU further or reduce noise levels, then you may need to consider an aftermarket solution instead. Additionally, while being based on the Zen 3 architecture, unlike their other Ryzen 5000 series counterparts that feature PCIe Gen 4 support, both the 5600G and the 5700G only support PCIe Gen 3. Now, before we begin testing the 5600G, there's a couple of things we need to discuss in order to understand exactly what we should expect from this APU. While you can use an APU as a stopgap solution while waiting to get a graphics card, it is not going to perform anywhere near to the level of a discrete GPU. Admittedly, Radeon Vega's graphics, while being slightly outdated in 2021, have still improved greatly over the last few years. Still, using Vega graphics instead of RDNA 2, much like the custom designed SoCs for the Steam Deck, is going to be a limiting factor when it comes to gaming performance. By the way, if you haven't yet, make sure to check out my video on the Steam Deck and its unique design. So you might be asking, what is the appeal of an iGPU? Well, even if you can't achieve high resolution, high refresh gaming, an iGPU is a perfect solution for the budget gamer who is only looking to play less demanding titles. It's not a bad idea at all, and it can help you save a buck. Additionally, an iGPU can be utilised in non-gaming tasks, where a discrete graphics card is not required, and can rely solely on CPU performance alone. Another thing to consider, while a graphics card can leverage its own memory, an APU will run off of system memory, meaning that memory speed can be crucial in achieving a higher frame rate. So it's worth opting for 3200 MHz speed or higher when it comes to these Ryzen APUs. For today's testing, I'll be using 3200 speed memory, which should give you a baseline of the sort of performance you'd expect, but bumping up to 3600 speed or higher will net you increased performance. There's a few other things I'd like to address, but let's get to the gaming first and see what sort of performance we can expect from the 5600G. So first up, we've got CSGO. This is probably the least demanding title that we'll be testing today. Just running this at 1080p medium settings. Now for all of the games today, I'm going to try and aim for 1080p medium, just so we can maintain some visual fidelity and keep that resolution higher. So, as you can see, we're going around, we're averaging around 118 FPS at the moment, which is really good to be fair, it's totally playable. There are a couple instances where there is some stuttering, but the overall performance and gameplay is actually extremely fluid. Like, I can actually play this happily at this resolution and these settings. So I know this type of game, you are wanting to have that FPS well over 100, which is completely doable with just a 5600G. If I had no choice and I could just play it like this, I would have no problems whatsoever. So how about we move on to our next title? So the next game we've been testing is a very newly released title from 2013. But anyway, I decided to test GTA 5 because it's one of those games that tends to scale very well depending on what hardware you use. So I've just been playing at around 1080p normal settings with FXAA and MSAA disabled. And obviously you can see we are suffering slightly in terms of jagged edges for objects. It's not the best. You could spend a bit more time tweaking this to get even better visual fidelity, but you are going to be limited in how much you can increase when running with just an iGPU. However, in terms of frame rate, we're sitting fairly well. We're averaging around 70 odd FPS, which is a fairly smooth experience. And like I said, even though you are losing some visual fidelity by having those settings a bit lower, I still say it's acceptable, but you are compromising a little bit. But overall, even with the jagginess from the lack of aliasing, it's still a perfectly enjoyable experience. As you start to enter more demanding sequences, you will see the frame rate slightly suffer because of that. With those 6 cores and 12 threads, it's doing a pretty good job of handling that additional load on the CPU itself. So that's a pass for me, to be honest. Let's try something else. So moving on to a slightly more demanding title, we've actually switched up to Doom 2016, and we are starting to be a little limited by our 5600G. Now we have actually had to drop down to low settings from medium in order to get closer to 60 FPS. And even then, we're still only hitting around 48 FPS on average, which is playable, but in a game like Doom, you are wanting to get as high as FPS as possible, and the visuals are starting to suffer because of it. So just to see, I'll drop this down to 720p medium or high and see how that looks. Okay, we've just dropped it down to 720p high, and it feels much more fluid than at 1080p, which is obviously going to be expected. This type of APU is a bit more suited towards 720p gaming, but obviously for today I wanted to throw a bit more of a heavy load onto it, just to see how far we could push it. But for a game like Doom, where you want to have as high as a refresh rate as possible, you probably would want to drop the resolution down on this. But even at 720p, it doesn't look too bad, but like I said, it is a compromise in order to get that high FPS. Now, as a bit of a change of pace on this one, I've decided to go for a really recent title and something that is definitely going to be a bit too demanding for the 5600G alone. So we're in Resident Evil Village, and to get it even playable, I have had to drop it down to 1080p low. Again, like with Doom, you could drop it down to 720p, but again, that is a compromise you would have to consider. But as it is for now at 1080p, I wouldn't say this is a very enjoyable experience. But another reason why I chose to try this title out as well is because of AMD's FSR implementation. So why don't we enable that and see if we can get any sort of improvement. Now, enabling FSR and opting for performance does it seem to increase our FPS fairly well. However, you are going to be dealing with a much more blurry image now that we're upscaling from a fairly low resolution. So if we were to go into a more demanding area like out in the castle, you will see that we all start to drop down pretty significantly. So if we approach this big lady, as we can see, the FPS is dropping very significantly at the moment. But another thing that's worth considering, this section of the game, you will be using a lot of resources to do these sorts of sequences. My best bet would be, again, much like with Doom, drop it down to 720p. So, overall, some pretty interesting results from gaming. As expected, you will see wide-ranging results depending on what titles you choose. While esports titles like CSGO should be pretty straightforward to run, more demanding AAA titles will put much more of a strain on the 5600G, meaning you will have to compromise when it comes to high visual fidelity or high FPS. It's worth noting though, that I have been pushing the 5600G pretty hard at 1080p, but if you are happy to drop down to 720p, you will be able to increase your overall FPS and pump up the graphics settings a little bit. As I mentioned with Resident Evil Village, it wasn't really a title that I was expecting to see great performance out of, but with its implementation of FSR, I thought it would be interesting to see its impact on bigger graphics. FSR implementation could improve even further and be of more use to the budget gamer who's looking to get that increased performance. In terms of compute performance, I also tested the 5600G in Cinebench R20 and compared it to the 5600X and also the previous generation Ryzen 5 3600, all of which were using the Wraith Stealth stock cooler, so that we could get an equal playing field for all the processors. And as expected, that reduction in L3 cache down to 16 MB from 32 MB on the 5600X does make the 5600G a smidge slower. Upgrading to an aftermarket cooler though will net you an increased performance when it comes to multi-core workloads. In conclusion, while the 5600G offers an excellent budget proposition to the entry-level gamer, you must manage your expectations when it comes to AAA gaming. In my opinion, if you're playing titles like CSGO, then it's a totally viable option. But you do still have the option of dropping in a discrete graphics card to increase your performance. But with the price of the 5600G still being pretty close to the 5600X, which will outperform the 5600G, you will have to weigh up whether the integrated graphics will be a worthy investment when you lose that functionality by adding a graphics card. Despite that, with the current market conditions and the fact that you can still buy a 5600G and a 5700G at MSRP a few days after launch, AMD are definitely providing a viable solution in the meantime. This may change over time, but for now though, the 5600G is an excellent option, and in a hugely demanding market, I'm happy to see that AMD are scaling down the Zen 3 stack even further. So, that's it for today's video. What are your thoughts on the Ryzen 5000 series APUs? Let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to like and subscribe for more videos on the way soon. Thank you, I'll see you next time.